inspired by Colossians 1, verses 16 and 17. For by him were all things created that are in heaven and that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether they be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created by him and for him, and he is before all things, and by him all things consist. What a great way to start Unfragmented, and welcome, where Leigh Bortons and I explore the connection between Christian thought and Christian action. I'm Kevin Novak, and today's August 2nd, 2023. And I do want to make mention before we get rolling here on our Shekels with Shackles discussion that you can go to deconstructingthecoliseum.com to read about my organization. And I would encourage you, if you're just going to that webpage for the first time, go to the About DTC page and read about jurisdiction and civil government school system abolition. And this week, you can actually go to that website, the homepage, to get a PDF of this Shekels with Shackles, which we're going to be talking about. Last month, we spoke about our nation's founding documents, and we talked about their characteristics and why they were necessary, of course, and how they're still relevant. And then this week, we've got an extra week this month, so we're going to take this extra week to talk about Shekels with Shackles. And a little history about that. It's a booklet that the Christian Education Initiative put together. You can go to christedu.org for the Christian Education Initiative. But this is a booklet that CEI put together so that it's comprised of different articles, which we'll talk about this week, but it's basically to inform policymakers and Christians and, of course, thought leaders on the dangers of school choice. So when I say school choice, I mean vouchers, education savings accounts, tax credits, and basically post-tax mechanisms that are operated by the civil government. Now, the title, as you can see, Shekels with Shackles, indicates that control belongs to those with the money. Christians ought to be in favor of what we call education freedom, not school choice. So we really just want no taxation for civil government schools. And again, you can get a copy of the Shekels with Shackles at deconstructingthecoliseum.com in the homepage. And in going over these articles this week, I think, Leigh, you're going to get us rolling with Article 1. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And then before I do so, let's let Michelle, Jennifer, and Nicole, do you mind doing brief introductions? This is our first time doing these as a podcast rather than a book club, and you're going to be our regulars. So I think it'd be great for the audience to get to know you better. So Jennifer, you look ready. Could you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
My name is Jennifer. My husband and I met in the Air Force after high school, and ended up settling down out here in California, and we're raising 2 kids right now. We have home educated both of them from the beginning. I think we were home educating them before we realized that we were home educating them. And much to my surprise, God just really knit a passion for education, and especially independent education in my heart as we all learned together.
Great. Well, we're glad to have you. How about you, Michelle? You look unmuted there.
Hi, my name's Michelle, and I have been home educating my kids their whole life. My husband and I have been married 39 years, and we met, oddly enough, in the Navy. I didn't know that about Jennifer in the Air Force. We too settled in California, and last year we escaped. So we've been in the Southeast here for a little more than a year, and we are educating our twins, one boy and one girl.
Great. Welcome, Michelle. Okay, Nicole, your turn.
All right. So I've been a Texan all my life. My husband and I have been married for 15 years, and we actually met on MySpace. We have 4 kids, and my husband and I we were both educators, and that was actually our motivation to want to consider homeschooling, because we realized that this was not what we remembered school to be, and this was no way we felt that we could do this, have that kind of system for our own children. So we've been My oldest is 9 and my youngest is a year old.
You're busy. All of us are busy. All right, Kevin, I really appreciated your introduction. It was a good overview of the document that we'll be reading. So what I wanted to do was just to kind of model for the audience who might come on later to watch, and then maybe, for all of us too, how we talk about the 5 common topics when we're looking at a new idea or studying something that we might not be familiar with. And you said a lot of the words that I want to define, because I felt like with this being a short article, it was only like 2 pages long, my article. So I wanted to take some time on the definitions. And so you said something about school choice. And a lot of this vouchers, Shekels with Shackles articles have school choice in quotes, air quotes. Why would they do that? What's the problem with calling it school choice? That you have to put it in air quotes. You want to answer that, Kevin? I'll call on you first.
Well, I think the problem with it is essentially you get trapped in what the civil government wants you to do. And I think that ultimately it isn't choice. I think it can be a matter of degrees, but if you're being funneled into a system where you're already paying taxes into it, it really is hard to make a free choice.
Mm-hmm.
And these are all post-tax mechanisms, so I wouldn't call that choice even in the first place. And I think there are other reasons why, but I would say that'd be the main reason why it shouldn't be called school choice.
Well, so then my next one I was going to ask you about relates to that. So tax-funded vouchers. So you're talking about pre and post taxes going to different things. Can you explain that to our audience, Kevin? And then I have some questions for you, the rest of you.
Right. So when people are taxed, and by the way, people that don't even have kids are also being taxed. So, I mean, that those people don't have a choice as to whether they're putting their taxes into this school choice system, mainly vouchers. But when we talk about post-tax mechanisms, we're talking about essentially the civil government having acquired our money by force and coercion, by compulsion, and then having that money. So anything they give us back is essentially it's their money. I'm not going to say it's our money, but it's their money, and we have to jump through hoops to get it back. But that's really what I mean by post-tax mechanisms. And then, of course, there are going to be strings attached to that and getting the money back from them, getting our money back from them. So when I talk about pre-tax mechanisms, really what I'm talking about are eliminating taxes or lowering taxes so that we get to keep our money, and then we get to go out in a capitalistic, in a free society and spend that money the way we see fit.
So instead of giving money and then saying, well, I want it back, you would rather just not give it to them at all in the first place.
Right. I would rather, and I think I want to say it was Dr. McMillan's article that talked about that. I'm sure several of the articles did,
Yeah.
But Dr. McMillan did point out, and we can talk more about this later, she said it's a false premise that when the civil government takes our money, people will say, oh, it's our money, in trying to justify utilizing a voucher. Oh, it's our money. Well, no, it's not, because they took it from us in the first place. And not to mention, I don't want to go off on too many tangents here, but not to mention, we have to pay for a bureaucracy to handle our, quote unquote, our money. And that's not ideal. Even in Arizona, you only get 90% of your state dollars. So anyway, it's not school choice.
No. Okay. Now, Michelle, the title of this article was called Shackles with Shekels. And believe it or not, in using this title, I've used it a lot. Somebody actually said to me, I don't know what a shekel is. So let's define these terms. They seem so basic to us. So do you know what a shekel is, Michelle?
Well, in the biblical times, a shekel was a monetary currency. And,
it is.
and a shackle basically is handcuffs or irons around our ankles. It's where you are tied to something, and you don't have the freedom to leave whatever it is that you're shackled to.
Yeah. Okay. That was a pretty clear explanation. And then I wanted to, so I've asked some definition questions. One of the other questions that we asked with the common topics is the authority. So my authority, in other words, the person I got these words from, my part of the article was from E. Ray Moore, who's a chaplain, which tells me what? That you would think he'd have some sort of Christ-centered worldview. He was a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Air Force, which would tell me that he probably has some sort of at least patriotic bent. And then he's chairman of CEI, which Kevin introduced us to, so the Christian Education Initiative. But more importantly, he's proud to say that he's the director of Exodus Mandate, which I happen to know is, to him, it's a mandate to get kids out of school. So from the authority perspective or testimony, it's really important to know who your authors are. And I would say that Ray is going to be biased towards getting kids out of public school. He's going to have a hard time hearing other arguments. So if you want to tell us a little bit about each of the authors too, when you guys get to your article, because I think there was a bio attached to all of them. So our audience will know that we're reading a document that was written by a lot of people, and 10 articles, I think, and then there was a wide variety of people who contributed to this. So it's not just the 5 of us. So Nicole, under what circumstances would you send your kids to public school? You're muted.
Under what circumstances would I send my kids to school would be under an extreme circumstance with my family situation, if probably both my spouse and I were unable to even care for our children, and our own parents would lack the inability to have any other options.
Yeah. So you're just really committed to your family life.
Yes.
Yeah. So now we know you're biased. And then how about you, Jennifer? Was there any situation where you would send your kids to school?
I have a hard time imagining a circumstance in which I would send them to a public school. I think you asked the question earlier, why is school choice in quotes? And I think it's because I believe this is a term that's been co-opted. We already have choice. We already have educational choice, and there are so many other choices I think that we would choose before public education. I agree with Nicole, it would need to be a pretty extreme circumstance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what are some of those other school choices? And then we'll go on. I'll stop talking.
For me?
Yeah. I mean, what are some other things that are out there? So that's one of the problems, is people just think all there is private school, which they think is expensive, homeschool, which they think takes too much time and commitment. And then of course, public school, which is free and someone else does the work.
Well, those are all options as well. And I think that even within those, there are, they can each look very different. There are private school options that are costly, and there are private school options that are not as costly. Within home education, there is a dizzying assortment of possibilities. And I would say, especially since 2020 and we were all driven home, one thing that I think we saw about parents is that we get very creative, and there's a lot of options, a lot of different ways to do education at home, from, well, several different educational philosophies to materials and curricula. I don't want to be the only one to answer though.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Michelle, what are some other ways you've seen people not send their kids to public school?
Well, during COVID, I have seen parents that were in a private school where they had their little friend group, and they decided that they were going to pull their resources together and hire one of the tutors that was part of the private school that was out of work. So they what they called their little pod, and they controlled how the day was going to go and who was going to be doing what and on what day. I think for myself, when you asked the other two ladies about the options, if I had to, what circumstance would I put my kids back into the institutionalized education? My backup plan is another homeschooling family that does the same curriculum that we do and that love my children as much as I do. So if I'm incapacitated, if my husband's incapacitated, or something should happen to either of us, that's my backup plan. Because I know how they feel about education, and they are strongly opposed to institutionalized education. So I do think the problem with choice is that the choice is one government option compared to another government option. And when the government starts doling out this money, they're putting restrictions on what is qualified. So they're making that determination ahead of time. And all we get to do, or all the person who gets to choose it, is go from one frying pan to another frying pan, maybe into a fire. So there really isn't that much choice.
Yeah, and that's what we're balking against, is calling it school choice in the quotes. Okay, so Jennifer, I think you were up next. Can you tell us a little bit about your article and open it up for discussion?
Yes. So another way we had talked about approaching these articles was reading a few quotes from the article and then discussing them. So I found this quote at the beginning of this article pretty interesting. So this one is called Vouchers. He who has the gold makes the rules. This is written by Diane Douglas and Richard Hawkins. To give a little background on them, Diane Douglas served as the Arizona Superintendent of Public Instruction from 2015 to 2019, among doing other things within the school district. And it looks like she is now an advisor on the Public School Exit Board. And then Richard Hawkins was also in the military. He's a retired lieutenant colonel from the Air Force, and it looks like he is currently assistant to the chairman at the Christian Education Initiative, who is the group that put out this pamphlet. So, okay, this quote was taken from it's from a national report. And I'll read the quote, and then I think it will be interesting to read the quote and then consider where it came from.
Can you tell us what page it's on so people can look it up when they hear the recording?
Yes, this is on page 7.
Okay. Yeah.
And it's indented. So it starts, our nation is at risk. Our once unchallenged preeminence in commerce, industry, science, and technological innovation is being overtaken by competitors throughout the world. This report is concerned with only one of the many causes and dimensions of the problem, but it is the one that undergirds American prosperity, security, and civility. We report to the American people that while we can take justifiable pride in what our schools and colleges have historically accomplished and contributed to the United States and the well-being of its people, the educational foundations of our society are presently being eroded by a rising tide of mediocrity that threatens our very future as a nation and a people. Our concern, however, goes well beyond matters such as industry and commerce, i.e. STEM and college and career ready. It also includes the intellectual, moral, and spiritual strengths of our people, which knit together the very fabric of our society. If an unfriendly foreign power had attempted to impose on America the mediocre educational performance that exists today, we might well have viewed it as an act of war. As it stands, we have allowed this to happen to ourselves. So when I read that, I thought, this is something that I think a lot of people today could really agree with, and it would really resonate with a lot of people today. But I found it very interesting that this was actually released in a report called
Ooh, you lost her.
Not a especially recent quote. This is from quite a while back, and I wondered how if this was the conclusion in 1983, how does that compare to what we see today in our education, in our schools?
Yeah. You got cut off for a minute. I think while you got cut off, you just said the title is A Nation at Risk from 1983. So just
Yes,
to catch everybody up.
I apologize. Yes, this was released in 1983, and that was really that really stood out to me in light of what I think we see in our schools today as well. So I was wondering, as we consider this excerpt, how do you guys see that this compares with the state of our nation and our education in our nation today?
Well, I think of two things when I hear this. I think of how Christianity, at least the kind of Protestant, Puritan, and Catholic too. I'm not excluding the Catholics here, but generally the Protestant or Puritan view, I think, set a standard of excellence. In other words, Christian excellence in our country. And the other thing I think of is being forward-looking. We're a nation of people that generally look forward, and that I think we take that for granted. And building infrastructure for bridges and highways and so on, for even when we're not going to be here as people, our children and grandchildren will be. And I thought about this. I thought about some of these things even during COVID, where I noticed things. Now this is anecdotal, but I noticed things like even the mail, the delivery of the mail was just terrible. Maybe it's just where I live, but it's service, and so many things have gone by the wayside. And I don't see where we're operating in excellence anymore. We have been living on what Gary DeMar talks about, like the borrowed Christian capital of our framers going back like 100 or 200 years ago. We were just dealing with the residual effect of that. Thankfully, there's still a little bit of it left, but it's hard for me to say like how large a contrast it is, because I was younger. I remember Reagan being president, but I was quite young. But I certainly have seen over my years in paying attention that we have seen a tremendous decline in not just Christianity and Christian ethics, but also excellence in society generally. So that's what I think of when I hear this quote.
I think also the date strikes you because so many people think, what happened, as though this all occurred 4 years ago, and they don't understand the 1,000 little cuts that have occurred over the 150 years we've actually had any form of public education. So it's just to me, because that's the first year I voted for Reagan in 1980, and so this article in 83 is when Robert was born. And that's where it was, when this report came out, that was one of the things that made Rob and I look for another way to educate our kids. So it's an important document for my life. So I'm glad you got to read it to me.
Well, oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I voted for Reagan the second time around because I just missed the 1980 cutoff. But I think it exemplifies that we just throw money, a dollar after dollar, in thinking that we're doing something good, but we're not really getting to the root of the problem. And I think you're right, Kevin. It's the fact that we don't, in education, there is not a moral compass anymore. And the moral compass can't just be in your private life. It has to be in your education. It has to be in the workplace. And that loss, because of, I don't know, maybe it's, I'm really learning about the Blaine amendments for the first time and understanding what they were, but it makes me think that this was like one of those other things where you're not forward thinking. Who was it in one of our books that talked about, we look at what's happening right now, we don't think about the consequences 40 years down the road. And was that one of those? Was that one of those historical moments where we didn't really look forward enough? So anyway, sorry, Jennifer, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, that's great, because that's actually one of the questions I wanted to ask next, is that after this report was published, then there was a summit held in 1989 where they started talking about educational reform. And at least as I'm reading this article, what it sounds like is, this is where a lot of our educational reform plans sort of flowed out of. One of the questions we ask in the 5 common topics is relationship. What did this cause, or what was a result of this? So one result of this report was this governor's education summit held in 1989, and flowing out of that was a plan called America 2000, an education strategy. And I hadn't heard of this, so I went to look it up, and I thought it was very interesting. At the beginning of it, it says this is a strategy. It's not a government program. This is a strategy, and it highlights 6 goals for America's education by the year 2000. Well, a little bit later, there was an act, which was law, called Goals 2000. And it's interesting because the things in this act are just exactly the same 6 goals that are listed in the strategy that's not a program. And then it ended up becoming a program. So I was wondering if you guys had any experience or background with these, and it's not the only reform that came out of this, so that those were goals set that were supposed to happen by the year 2000. And just for example, one of them was that the high school graduation rate would be at least 90%, and that U.S. students, another one was that U.S. students would be first in the world in science and mathematics achievement. That was going to happen by the year 2000. And so I think we know that didn't happen. And so what was the next step? What was the result of that? More educational reforms. So I'm curious what you guys know about educational reforms. What have you seen in the way of educational reforms? How do they compare with one another, and have they worked?
I can speak on No Child Left Behind Act that came in not long after. That would have been the year 2000, the No Child Left Behind Act, because I saw that I guess it was in high school maybe, or college when it first came out. So when I started teaching, we had the No Child Left Behind Act, and I could see how that became the big push, was that if we had these higher standards for kids, and that they'll achieve those goals, right? But really all it was is that the kids have to pass these tests, and all these kids have to take these tests, all the same tests. And then teachers were going, okay, now they're just teaching to the test. And so sometimes kids are learning so much more information completely out of context, and they're just memorizing things in order to pass a test. So that would be one thing that I saw in my personal experience.
Nicole, so you have the teaching background. Were any of these movements, or was there a movement happening while you were teaching?
I don't. So being in Texas, a lot of teaching, the schools are not quite, especially teachers, were not unionized. So I don't think there was a whole lot of political stuff that really went on that we were very much aware of, just because those discussions just didn't really happen. But we all knew how detrimental the push for the standardized testing, and then also under Obama, he basically redid the same thing, but it was called Every Student
Succeeds.
Yeah. And it was the same thing. It changed nothing, but now it's Obama's education, and nothing changed. And then Trump was elected kind of towards the tail end of my teaching, and there was nothing there. So is that
COVID hit? Well, the thing is, it's the author that you're reading from, Jennifer, calls it the educational industrial complex, which I'm going to use that. I not thought of that phrase. And so it says creating one educational reform program after another. Well, creating one, actually it says one failed educational reform program after another. And that's again what's happening now. It's like people are well-intentioned, but they just don't understand that the government is not what fixes this problem. So when you've ended with your part, Jennifer, that you read out loud about if a friendly foreign power attempted to impose on America the mediocre educational performance that exists today, we would have viewed it as an act of war. So put yourself in the shoes of a mom and dad that are Christians living on the farm. They have their kids that they love around them, helping them. And somebody comes to them and says, oh, your kids have to come with me now. And by the way, I'm going to make sure they hate Christ and don't think you're very smart by the time we're done with them. Please give them to me right now. Right. That's what this is referring to. And people just don't even think about the context that they're giving their children away to someone, and it's not them, the parents.
Well, that is actually, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, one of the things that I don't want to say I enjoy thinking about this because it's painful, but one thing that I do ponder a lot is where is the dividing line between the people, like I would say Barack Obama, in knowing what they're doing and imposing this on us, and knowing that they're part of the industrial complex and they're going to continue this, imposing these thoughts on our children, and knowing what they're doing, versus someone who might be even a liberal that's in the trenches, and they are well-intentioned. My point is that, at what point do we see the transition from someone who's doing this on purpose to someone who really just doesn't know, and they are well-intentioned, even if they're a liberal?
Well, don't you think that's what's happening now with all the revolt that's going on with school boards and parents jerking their kids out? That hideous strength, the book we read, is so prevalent that everyone's going, okay, there's a problem here. And when I say everyone, it's just half the populace. The other half still thinks it's all a good idea.
Mm-hmm.
So
I do think people like, and even George Bush, I don't want to go off on that, would be a long tangent, but Barack Obama, I think he knew what he was doing, and they want to keep these mechanisms in place, and they can do it under the guise of trying to do well for people. So I think the higher ups know exactly what they're doing, is I guess my point.
Well, so they put UNESCO on that list of the industrial complex, and they actually have an article explaining how to do exactly what's going on now in order for the governments to take over all of private education. And I'm writing an op-ed on that. So, and then if you go back and you read from the 50s and 60s, George Soros's papers on education, we're right at the moment that they all planned for. So there's a plan.
Well, that actually kind of wraps up what I was, some of the thoughts that I wanted to bring tonight. So I think this quote at the bottom of page 8 kind of ties everything that you're saying, kind of wraps it up pretty well. It says, and the article does go on, and it is, there's actually a lot more in it, but I knew I had to select a small portion for tonight. So this quote is at the bottom of page 8. It says, our education industrial complex is either deliberate, incompetent, or both regarding improvement for academic performance, but exceedingly competent at altering and cementing students' worldviews. And it goes on to talk about some of what we talked about was it 2 months ago now, about political correctness and cultural Marxism. And then it talks about some of the things that have since come into our education system since this report in 1983. And at the bottom of the first paragraph on page 10, it says, what has been occurring is the gradual coercion and transition from parental control for raising children to state control. Yeah. So I think that's exactly what you were saying, Leigh. If someone came to your door and said, hand over your kids, we're going to raise them now, we would not willingly submit to that.
Yeah. Okay, so you get to be next, Nicole.
All right, so this one was written by Alex Newman, and since we did get to have him on, and know that he's a journalist, and some of the stuff that he does is a lot with the UN and UNESCO, specifically. So in he's writing about what will happen if private schools take this tax money, and that how the UN will basically be able to use that to their advantage in order to put private schools under their control, because it'll come with the shackle in the sense that they will have the authority to regulate these private schools. And UN and a lot of the liberal, their big word, and this word was repeated many times so we can define it more, is all these regulations for private schools will help create equity. And the UN and everyone is pushing for equity, and private schools would then no longer be private schools, but they would be considered public-private partnerships, which some of those things already, kind of exist.
Yeah, that PPP, public-private or private-public partnerships, it's been around a very long time. And so, I mean, anytime you hear about, well, if a private company builds a road for a state, that's a private-public partnership. So they're ubiquitous and they're normal, and they've been normalized. And so now they're just putting them into family services, which before the social work would have always been, see, the thing about this comparison, the social work would have always been from a government agency. Now they want the private schools to do the social work for the government. People don't think about it that way. That's what's happening. And then the private schools will have to do the social work the way that the government tells them.
Well, and one of the advantages we've seen of this type of partnership from the socialist perspective is that they can continue to criticize the private entity. We see this with Wall Street all the time, where the feds are going to control Wall Street, and they're always one step behind because they're going to be one step behind capitalism always. Mm-hmm. But they can always criticize Wall Street because Wall Street is not in a de facto sense, but in a legal sense, it's still free. It's still capitalistic. Mm-hmm. But when it goes south, then the feds, the civil authorities, can condemn the private companies and then also use that as an excuse to pass more legislation.
Yeah. So Nicole, what's your question or quote for us?
Well, one of the questions I had for y'all, since it did mention how kind of Republicans and libertarians, is, what would have pushed the conservative and libertarian type people that are claiming limited government, what has caused them to latch on to this idea that tax dollars should follow the child?
I mean, it's two names, Thomas Sowell and Milton Friedman. Those two are some of my very favorite authors, greatest men of economic thinking of all time. But when it came to schools, they lost their marbles. And so that's been part of the conservative culture, is that it's not okay for universal health care or universal basic income or universal housing. But for some reason, those two men thought it was okay to have universal public education and to have the public schools pay, or the government the taxpayers through the government pay and control them. That's what I think they're relying on now, because I hear them talk about it all the time. Anybody else have any idea? Because otherwise, I don't understand it myself.
Yeah, I have not. It boggles me. I really, like you said, Leigh. I mean, people are able to analyze medicine and other free markets, and maybe there's a psychological component there that people just don't think that they're, maybe deep down they feel like they're not qualified to handle their own family. There's something there. There's a sticking point. I really don't understand that. I should not think about this before going to sleep at night, but I do, and it keeps me awake, and I just don't understand it. It doesn't make any sense to me. So to me, I think you're right about Sowell and Friedman. In fact, I think it was Bill Olson that mentioned Friedman in one of the later articles But anyway, Article 9. But yeah, just there's something psychological going on with those people because being libertarians, you would think they've got to know how taxation works. I would think, unless they don't understand that. Maybe they don't understand that part.
Well, Corey DeAngelis told me that the way I talk, that I don't want taxes for anything. And I just said, oh, no, I want taxes for the things that are enumerated in our Constitution, but not for anything else. That's where it ends. So then they say they're constitutionalists and they're not. But Michelle, what do you think? Where's this coming from? You're old like me. What happened?
What'd you call me?
We are middle-aged now, at least.
Oh my gosh. So when Nicole was talking, I was thinking that it's a power struggle, it's this control. And I was practicing my questions with my son tonight, and unfortunately my husband came in, and then it became an editorial on his part. But he says they're all just crooks. They want to steal all our money and do with it as they please. And I guess in some ways I would agree with him. I probably would have a little more grace about it instead of, just plain out calling them crooks. But that I do think that it's just part of, they're justifying why they are where they are. Mm-hmm. And this makes the most sense to them. So,
well, there's such a thing as political expediency, where they feel like they're trying to stop the slippery slope. They're trying to give people options until there can be a mass shutdown. And I keep going, we had a mass shutdown. Did you forget? It was called COVID. Like, we know how to do this, and they want to take their time doing it in baby steps. And then, there's always the political argument about you compromise like you do in football. You just want to get it, one more yard down towards your goal. And to me, and I know for you guys too, that's not good enough. One, because philosophically, they aren't continuing that conversation to see where the negative side. But the other thing is, if you have a child getting chemotherapy that's healthy, when you want them out of there immediately, wouldn't you be mad at that doctor? So
yeah,
it's children. Yeah. There's no slippery slope, and there's no time. It's got to be done.
Yeah. Yep.
So.
I think Heather Hall touches on this in one of the later articles, and she says that one of the common arguments she hears is that, oh, well, roadways are tax funded. And she says that's not a valid argument, because roadways are provided for in the Constitution, and whereas education is not. But a lot of people will try to lump it in with general welfare and think that education is a right. But it isn't enumerated as one of the as falling under general welfare. And I think I don't think our right to education comes from the Constitution, but it's a biblical right. It's a biblical mandate for parents to educate their children.
Mm-hmm. So Nicole, did this alarm you that the United Nations is so involved?
It is. I didn't realize that they would be able to see how they could benefit from the school choice programs and vouchers. I didn't really think, I thought they would be so against it. But then they realized that they can use it for their advantage and get what they want out of it.
Yeah, I think they're in a funny place, because you got these Democratic governors like ours in North Carolina that had that said, it's a state of emergency because of school choice going across the country. And I was like, okay, I don't know if you're my friend or my enemy, but I know that you're the UN's enemy, whether you know it or not. It's like they're waiting for the Republicans and Democrats to just beat each other up, and to make it so bad between that and the fiat money and inflation and housing costs. And you'll want to rent, you won't want to own anything, and then this world government can come in and make it all better for us. I think that's what they're doing.
Yeah, I think that is the end goal with the UN, is that it is a one world government, and it's not the United States of America. It's not the United whatever they call themselves, the European Union, they would take complete and absolute control. And I find it appalling that they are on our tax-funded property in New York.
It's been a problem for decades for people.
Yeah.
Well, Michelle, it's your turn. So we only have about 10 minutes left. Why don't you share with us your article?
All right. So I too have an article by Diane Douglas. So I won't repeat her biography because Jennifer did such a fantastic job. But what I would add to it is looking through the lens of Diane Douglas's career. It has been in public education and it has been in civil government. So the article it starts on page 17 and it's caveat emptor, Arizona's ESA voucher expansion. So I actually had an exordium, which is farther in the article, but it's this one little quote. It says, you establish what they can buy, where they can buy it, and how much they can spend. And this is from, it is in the middle, on page 18, right in the middle paragraph, or the middle of the page, halfway down. So you establish what they can buy, where they can buy it, and how much they can spend. And so I wanted to define, and this is Diane's definition, you, in this case, is from Class Wallet, and Class Wallet is a provider of purchasing and reimbursement services using their patented digital wallet technology for schools, state agencies, family scholarships, and more. So for Arizona, you is the Arizona Department of Education, the State Board of Education, or the Arizona legislature. So they are the ones that can tell they who are the parents. And I just found that to be eye-opening when you break it down to that, in that simplicity. So Diane has supported school choice with the public charter schools because she did feel that competition was going to boost the success in the 4 R's. And so with Arizona, so this is basically all about Arizona's school voucher program. So they, in 2011, enacted the Empowerment Scholarship accounts. And it was legislation that, while frequently referred to as vouchers, it's basically a voucher system. So I had a couple of definition questions, but I also initially just wanted to ask you, what stands out to you with that? In 2011, Arizona enacted the Empowerment Scholarship Accounts legislation.
Yeah.
When
Who
you
are they
hear that,
empowering?
right? Who are they empowering? So what is empowerment?
Mm-hmm. I think empowerment's being taught how to fish, right? Rather than being fed all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, they think it's an entitlement.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So why do you think that the legislature used that term empowerment?
Because it has a kind of a more positive sounding, and it sounds like it's putting you, the person or the parent, in power and control by the sound of it.
The other thing is if by not saying education, it opened up so they can put all kinds of things under here, right? You could be empowered to buy your first house. You could be empowered to buy a new car. You could be empowered for all kinds of things, because it doesn't say education.
Right.
And who
But,
would say no to that? Who wouldn't want to be empowered?
Right.
That's great.
And so what is a scholarship?
It is a donation. It's either voluntary charity because somebody wants to give it to you, or it is mandated welfare because there's a law that says it has to be given to you. And I think that's one thing we Christian parents have to start paying attention to, is that we all want scholarships for our kids. And that's lent to Christians being blindsided by this, and because we're used to saying, well, someone else should pay for our kids.
Yeah. But how do you get a scholarship?
Well, you should be earning it. You should be earning it with good grades or some other way.
So if somebody with a big heart wants to give or has created a scholarship, how do they determine who should be awarded the scholarship? What is it that you have to do to say to that organization, me?
You have to apply for a
deserve it.
scholarship, right?
You have to apply for it. Right. So the empowerment scholarship accounts all have to be applied for. And in 2011, it was only for students that had disabilities. And sorry, hold on one second. I've got somebody calling me. Excuse me. So my whole screen went blank. So, I did have another definition question, but I'm gonna skip over that. So it wasn't something that if all the students that had disabilities in Arizona, they would just be given the funds so that the parents could have their choice as to where they can get their services. They had to apply for it. Well, last summer in 2022, the Republicans in both the Arizona House and Senate voted in favor for a new expansion bill, and it was called HB 2853, while every Democrat voted against it or was a no vote. So HB 2853 is touted as an expansion of the ESA government aid program to all Arizona students. And you can even, there's a completely different website, and it makes it beautiful on how all students are eligible for this scholarship. Well, I found some discrepancies in the term all. So on the Arizona Department of Education's website, it lists qualified students meeting any of the following requirements: that they're a preschool student with a disability, they're a K through 12 student with special needs, they're children of an active duty military parent, they're children of a military parent who's been killed in the line of duty, they are students that attend a D or F rated school, so a subpar school. They are students residing within a Native American reservation. They're siblings of current or previous ESA recipients, or they're a student who was a ward of the court, or a previous recipient of an ESA. So does that sound like all to you?
No, but you know what they did? They added another section, Michelle, that's probably a little bit newer than what you just read.
Okay, because that was from right after it got passed, I thought, when I was looking.
So there's what happens. It's the whole Nancy Pelosi thing. We don't know what it says, so we pass it. They passed it, and then they rewrote sections.
Oh, those little stinkers.
Yeah.
So
because you were right. That's what I was thinking when I first read it. I was like, this is just entitlement for people that are so-called needy, and they made it for everybody.
Right. So in her article, Diane makes the argument that there's a huge difference between allowing all students to be eligible to apply for an ESA and funding every student. So she's saying why is it that you are just not creating these digital wallets for everybody, and then everybody just gets to do with it as they please? Now, that to me is that mindset of an educator who believes in institutionalized education. But so anyway, she continues by speculating that ESAs may be used to achieve the ultimate goal of the Marxists gaining control over private schools. It also, I speculate that with the homeschooling side of it, the way Arizona defines the homeschool law is you have to submit a notarized affidavit with your local school superintendent 30 days before you start homeschooling, or if you move to a new district, you have to resubmit it in your new district. But if you sign an ESA contract, then you are no longer a homeschooler. You are an ESA student. And they have a 79-page handbook that has an exhaustive list of approved and disapproved spending, limits on qualifications of allowed services. So tutors have to be credentialed, teachers need to be credentialed, and it provides the policies and procedures and implementation of the ESA program. So my next question is, wait, hold on.
Can I stop you so we can go to
Yeah.
Kevin's article? That was really good. Listen, thank you for getting that other
Okay.
research. The people in Arizona will appreciate it.
By the way, I do, if you don't mind me just interjecting really quick about this article from Diane Douglas, what concerns me is that she says towards the end, hopefully the current ESA expansion will be a step in the right direction. When I originally read this, I just, to me, this is a black and white issue. I don't see how you get to a maybe. I really don't see it. But
yeah,
anyway,
that was
the article,
those were my next questions. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up.
I think she's moving closer in our direction, just so you know, but I, don't know.
Okay,
for sure.
good. Yeah, and I don't know Diane,
end
but
the article with, he with the gold rules, and rulers rarely truly voluntarily give up their power.
No.
She does end with that.
Mhm.
so this article by Dr. Marlene McMillan, Vouchers Without Choice, and Leah, you had asked me about this when we first began tonight's show. And Dr. McMillan, by the way, she has a degree from John Brown University, a Master of Divinity degree from Southwestern Baptist, and a Doctor of Ministry from Tyndale Theological. She operates an organization called Why Liberty Matters, and she writes books and distributes pamphlets and so on. So this article here is a condensed version of the longer version, which you can find on whylibertymatters.com. But just a couple short quotes here. One, I find it refreshing how she originally deals with false premises. And one of those is that once money is in the coffers of the ISD, it is still the taxpayers' money. And I think we talked about that earlier, where it is, well, once they take it from you, you don't, it's not yours anymore. They can do with it what they will. So I find that refreshing. She dealt with that. Here's another quote. Freedom of thought requires freedom of finance. Freedom of finance leads to freedom of thought. And then just one other quote here. The goal and content of private and civil government education is different. Private education is to prepare children to be self-governing for their own safety and happiness, whereas the state school is to prepare children to conform for the so-called good of the collective. These opposing goals cannot be paid for by the same source. And so one of the questions I wanted to ask is just a very basic one, and Dr. McMillan didn't use the word socialism there, but I did want to ask, and just take a moment here, because I think this will get us to taking a more principled approach to determining whether school choice is proper. Not whether we like it, but whether it's proper, whether it's right or wrong. So I did just want to ask, when we use the word socialism, what thoughts do you have, and how would you define socialism?
So
Well,
oh, go ahead. You go, Jennifer.
Well, I'm not sure, but when I think of socialism, I think of equality across the board. You know, if one person has a house that's 1,200 square feet, the neighbor's house is 1,200 square feet. If one person has, you know, I don't know, a backyard with 2 plots of grass and a sidewalk in the middle, and that's what the neighbors looks like too. Everybody has exactly the same thing across the board.
That's really what they mean by equity. What about you, Nicole or Michelle?
I think it's basic equity. But when Jennifer was talking about the 1,200 square feet, who was it that said, I think it was during the 1930s, it was a politician who said about a chicken in every pot. Come on, Leigh, you're old like me. You should remember
Yeah, I don't
this.
remember who said it.
But you know what I'm talking
Wow.
about. That's what
Yeah.
I thought of, is that, you know, everybody should have a chicken in the pot. Everybody should, you know, have the exact same things. You know, maybe we all just ought to get uniforms and not have to
Mhm.
worry about my fancy yellow earrings.
So Macmillan herself says in the article, socialism is the redistribution of wealth.
Oh,
Mhm.
yeah, that's it.
Yeah. So what about you?
Well,
Nicole?
Oh, I was just, yeah, well, I was going to say the redistribution of wealth, but also the idea that the society, which I think that's where the social word come from, is that society is the one that's controlling everything and not just supposedly these wealthy capitalist corporations controlling everything.
That's good. It's rooted society, and isms are always worship of some idol.
That's good. Yeah, and that, you know, my notes here, I did write redistribution of wealth. When I was younger, I actually asked someone years and years ago, what is socialism? And the way they explained it to me, which I've carried with me throughout these years, and I think this is a good description, is socialism is capitalism with heavy taxation and heavy regulation. Because there still is capitalism, and people still get to own things, and that would obviously be distinguished with communism, where the civil government owns the things. And so I guess a simple way of putting socialism too might be taking money from some people and giving it to others. And then I did want to ask, you know, so if we think of socialism and maybe some words that describe it, what about capitalism? And how is socialism different than capitalism? And I know that sounds abstract, but maybe in your mind, how do you contrast the two? What are some things that come to mind that you think describe the differences between the two?
From a root perspective, socialism is the protecting of the society, and the society is the main thing. So capitalism is saying that there's a value to capital, and there's a protection and a system around capital. And so socialism doesn't necessarily have to be an economic term, but that's how it's used, versus capitalism is always an economic term.
That's good. I never thought of that. You know, what's funny too is as much as I've used the word capitalism, it's never occurred to me to break it down that way. I just took it for granted that it was centered on private ownership and so on. I never thought of it that way, as like having a positive connotation like you described.
You know, George Gilder, remember, he told us capital comes from kaput. It means your head. It's about thinking and reasoning. And that's your greatest capital any of us own, is our mind.
Oh. Yeah, and
What about? Go ahead, Michelle.
No, I was just going to say with the institutionalized learning that is happening right now, your brain is going sort of kaput because they're not giving you that information to make the decisions that for yourself.
Mm.
Yeah,
your
there's no
choices.
reason to burn books if you can burn their brains.
Well, I was only briefly going to ask also, what is an entitlement? But I think we've gone about an hour. If you don't mind me just mentioning, one of the things that I think of the distinction between socialism and capitalism is inefficiency. And I think that's very relevant to school choice. I think it's very relevant because this is another thing that boggles me, in that people only want 90% of their state tax dollars back. And thinking that's a good thing is just ludicrous.
Yeah.
And I would love the chance to ask Corey DeAngelis about that too. But anyway, the other question I was just going to ask, and we can talk about this another time, is just about an entitlement, because I'm not so sure that we really define that when we're talking about these things.
Yeah. Well, so next week we're doing the tree book, The Beautiful Tree by James
Beautiful
Dewey.
Tree, yeah.
So let's make sure we open up describing some of these, or defining entitlement and comparing it to some of the other words before we start reading parts of his book, because he's going to be talking about people who, through their own capital, put together their own school systems. And so we'll need to keep defining those words. So with that, I'm going to say thanks, and we're going to sign out. And it was really great talking with you guys, and we'll see everybody next week.
Oh, wait a minute.
All right.
Wait a minute.
Right.
We have one thing. We have one thing to add.
Yeah.
If you have liked this podcast, please go to the like button below and subscribe so that this will pop
All
up
right.
into your YouTube feed.
That's right. And our producer Emma is going to attach Shackles with Shackles as a on the YouTube comment area, or however you do that, because I don't know anything about technology. All right. That's why Michelle had to
All
remind
right.
me. Thanks, guys.
Okay,
Thanks,
thanks
Leigh.
everybody.